The funeral home still smelled like carnations when my sister-in-law pulled me aside and told me I had 30 days to get out of the house. Not my mother-in-law. My sister-in-law, Bridget. The woman who'd been my maid of honor 6 years ago, who'd cried at our wedding, who'd held my hair back when the morning sickness hit hard in my first trimester. That Bridget. My husband Owen had been dead for 11 days. I was 29 years old, 14 weeks pregnant, and standing in the hallway of the house we'd bought together in Oakville, Ontario, while his sister told me in a voice so calm it made my skin crawl that the family had discussed things, and it would be best if I started thinking about next steps. I didn't say anything. I just looked at her. I think part of me was waiting for her to laugh, to say she was joking, to do literally anything that would make this moment make sense. She didn't. She smoothed her blazer, said she'd get me some privacy, and walked back out to join the rest of them in the living room. I sat down on the bottom stair and put my hand on my stomach. Owen had died on a Tuesday. He was driving back from a site visit. He was a structural engineer, always out to some construction project in the GTA, when a transport truck ran a red on the 401 and hit the driver's side of his car. He was gone before the paramedics arrived. The police officer who came to our door that night was so young he looked like he should still be in high school. I remember thinking that. I remember almost nothing else from that night except that one strange, disconnected thought. We hadn't even announced the pregnancy yet. We were waiting until the second trimester, doing things right, the way Owen liked to do everything, carefully, properly, with a plan. We'd told his mother the week before because she was visiting, and I was visibly exhausted and we didn't want her to worry. She'd hugged me. She'd cried. She'd said she was so happy. That was 3 weeks before the accident. Now, 11 days after we'd buried her son, she sat in my living room and let her daughter deliver my eviction notice. I want to be clear about something because when I've told this story, people always ask, why didn't you fight back right away? Why didn't you call a lawyer that same day? The answer is that grief does something to your brain that nobody warns you about. It's not sadness exactly. It's more like the volume on everything gets turned down and you move through your days wrapped in something thick and muffling. I knew, somewhere underneath all that cotton wool, that what Bridget had said to me was wrong. I knew it legally, practically every way you could measure it. Owen and I had bought this house together. My name was on the mortgage. I was his wife and the mother of his unborn child. No one could make me leave. But knowing something and being able to act on it are two very different things when you're 14 weeks pregnant and your husband has been dead for 11 days. So I didn't fight. Not yet. I went upstairs, I lay down on our bed, his side still had the faint shape of him in the pillow, and I stared at the ceiling until everyone left. The campaign started small. My mother-in-law began coming by every day, always with some reason, always perfectly polite on the surface. She'd brought a casserole. She wanted to pick up a few of Owen's things. She thought we should talk about the estate. That last one caught my attention, even through the fog. Owen had a life insurance policy through his firm, a good one, standard for engineers at his level, and there were his RRSP accounts, the equity in the house. I wasn't worried about money. Not immediately. We'd always been careful. But then she sat across from me at my own kitchen table and slid a piece of paper across the surface. It was a handwritten list of debts, credit cards I didn't recognize, a line of credit in Owen's name alone, a personal loan. The total at the bottom was just over $80,000. I found these going through his office, she said. I thought you should know before you made any financial decisions. I stared at the paper. This can't be right. I thought the same thing. She folded her hands. But the statements are all here, I can show you. She did show me, and the statements were real. They had Owen's name on them, his SIN, his signatures. I spent 3 nights going through every piece of paper I could find in our home office, pulling up bank records on his laptop, trying to understand. The credit cards weren't ones I knew about. The accounts had been opened almost 2 years ago. What I couldn't figure out was why. Owen hadn't been a secretive person. He was meticulous, spreadsheets for everything, color-coded folders, a shared budget app we'd used since our second year of marriage. There was no version of him I knew that ran secret debt. It made no sense. And then Bridget mentioned, almost in passing, that Owen had invested in something with a friend from university, a development project somewhere north of the city. She said it like it was old news, like I should have known. I didn't know. I had never heard of it. I called his best friend, a guy named Theo who'd been at the funeral and had hugged me for a long time without saying anything. I asked him about the investment. He was quiet for a moment, then said he'd come over. Theo sat at that same kitchen table and told me that about 18 months ago, Owen had been approached by someone he'd known since university, a guy who'd always seemed to have some opportunity going, some deal just coming together. Owen had put in $40,000 of his own savings toward what was supposed to be a pre-construction condo development. The permits fell through. The developer disappeared. Owen lost everything he put in, and in trying to recover the loss quietly without worrying me while I was dealing with a difficult first trimester, he'd taken out loans to cover the gap in our savings. He'd been planning to pay them down before I ever noticed anything was wrong. He was embarrassed, Theo said, not meeting my eyes. He kept saying he'd fix it before he had to tell you. He hated that he'd been fooled. I didn't say anything for a long time. He should have told me, I finally said. Yeah, said Theo, he should have. I don't blame Owen. I've worked through that and I don't. He made a mistake and then he made the very human choice to try to fix it in secret, and then the universe took him before he could. What I do know is that my mother-in-law had known about this. Bridget had let that slip without realizing it and had chosen the timing of her revelation very carefully. She'd waited until I was most alone, most raw, most unable to fight, and then placed that piece of paper in front of me like a flag of surrender she expected me to sign. The morning after Theo's visit, she called me. She didn't ask how I was. She asked if I'd had a chance to think about the practicalities. She said, and I remember the exact words because I have replayed them hundreds of times, that a single woman with a baby and that level of debt might find it very difficult to manage a property like this. She said she and Bridget could help me list it. They knew a realtor. They could handle everything. And the baby? I said. A pause. There are options, sweetheart. At your age, with everything on your plate, you don't have to make any decisions right now, but you shouldn't close any doors. I hung up. I sat in my kitchen for probably an hour. I looked out the window at our backyard. Owen had built the raised garden beds along the fence himself, weekend by weekend, 2 springs ago. The tomato cages were still up from last season. I was not going to lose this house. I was not going to lose this baby. And I was not going to let 2 women use my grief as a doorway into my life. The problem was that I didn't know how to start. I'm a dental hygienist. I know teeth. I know my patients' names and which ones need to floss more and which ones have anxiety about the chair. I did not know anything about estates or life insurance claims or what happened to a mortgage when a spouse died. I had been so focused on surviving each day that I hadn't made a single phone call to anyone official. My colleague at the clinic, a woman who'd been practicing for 20 years and had seen everything, was the one who finally snapped me out of it. She showed up at my door on a Saturday with groceries and a list of phone numbers she'd written out by hand. A grief counselor, a family lawyer, the number for Owen's HR department at his firm. You need to make these calls Monday morning, she said, in this order. The lawyer's name was Miss Beaumont. She had an office in downtown Oakville, a calm voice, and about 30 seconds of patience for the story before she started taking notes. She explained that Owen's life insurance policy, the one through his employer, which I had not yet contacted because I hadn't known how, was almost certainly payable directly to me as his named beneficiary. It would not form part of the estate. It was not subject to his debts. She asked if I knew the approximate value. I found the policy documents that evening. The payout was just over $600,000. Ms. Beaumont also explained that the debts my mother-in-law had presented, the $80,000, were in Owen's name alone. In Ontario, a spouse is not automatically liable for a deceased partner's personal debt unless you co-signed. I had not co-signed anything. Those creditors could make a claim against the estate, which would affect what remained after debts were settled, but they could not come after me personally. They could not take the house. My name was on the title. My name was on the mortgage. I had every right to remain exactly where I was. She told you to sell, Miss Beaumont said, less a question than a statement. She said she had a realtor. There was a pause on her end that I think was her choosing not to say what she was actually thinking. You don't have to sell anything, and if anyone, family included, attempts to pressure you or misrepresents your legal situation to you again, that's something we can address formally. I drove home from that meeting and sat in my car in the driveway for a while, looking at Owen's garden beds. Then I went inside and called Owen's HR department. The woman I spoke to was kind and efficient. She walked me through the life insurance claim process, sent me the paperwork by email before I'd even hung up, and mentioned, almost as an aside, that Owen's firm also had a workplace accidental death benefit that I would likely be eligible to apply for given the circumstances of the accident. His death occurred while he was traveling for a scheduled site visit, she said. That does fall within the policy parameters. You'll want to look at that application when you're ready. I wrote that down 3 times. Over the next 2 weeks, I made calls. I filled out forms. I contacted the insurance company and submitted the life insurance claim. Ms. Beaumont sent a letter, formal, professional, no room for misinterpretation, to my mother-in-law and to Bridget, outlining my legal standing with respect to the property and the estate, and advising them that all future communications regarding financial or property matters should go through her office. My mother-in-law called me the day she received it. She was not calm this time. She said I was being cruel. She said Owen would be ashamed of me. She said she was his mother and she had rights. I let her speak. Then I said, I loved your son. I'm going to have his child, and I'm not moving. She hung up on me. I won't tell you the weeks that followed were easy because they weren't. Grief doesn't pause for logistics. I cried in the lawyer's parking lot. I cried filling out insurance forms. I stood in the baby section of a store one afternoon and had to leave because I couldn't breathe. I went to the grief counselor my colleague had recommended every Thursday at 4 o'clock, and I slowly started to learn the difference between the grief I had to carry and the weight other people were trying to hand me. The life insurance was paid out 8 weeks after I filed the claim. The accidental death benefit came through 3 months later, combined with the equity in the house, which I kept. I was not the penniless, helpless woman my mother-in-law had needed me to be for her plan to work. I went back to work part-time at the clinic when I was 20 weeks along. My colleagues had covered my patients without a word of complaint. My patients asked after me with a gentleness I hadn't expected. Old Mr. Harding, who'd been coming to us for years and always brought in shortbread at Christmas, told me his wife had died when their youngest was 2 and that she'd grown up wonderful. And then he patted my hand very carefully and didn't say anything else. That was the moment I cried in front of a patient, just once. My daughter was born in late September at Oakville Trafalgar Memorial. Owen's tomatoes had gone wild by then. I'd watered them through the summer almost without thinking, some kind of muscle memory, and I'd actually harvested a ridiculous amount of them in August, enough that I was dropping bags off with neighbors. Something about that felt important to me, though I couldn't have explained it at the time. I named her Rosalind. It had been on our list. My mother-in-law has not met her. That is her choice, made the moment she decided that a grandchild was a negotiating chip rather than a person. Bridget reached out once, about 4 months after the birth, with a message that was part apology and part justification, and I read it twice and didn't reply. Maybe one day, maybe not. I have stopped letting that question take up space it doesn't need. Theo comes by every few weeks. He brings her little things, a rattle, a book, a tiny Vancouver Canucks onesie that I put her in mostly to see his face when he saw it, since he's a Leafs fan. He is good with her. He looks at her sometimes with an expression I recognize as guilt, and I've told him to stop, that Owen's choices were Owen's and he doesn't need to carry them. I'm not sure he believes me yet. There's something I've thought about a lot in the year since Owen died. He kept that secret because he was ashamed and because he wanted to fix it and because he loved me and didn't want me to worry. Those are all real things. They don't make me less angry that he did it, but they are real. The version of him I loved was not a lie. He was just a person who made a mistake and ran out of time. What I know for certain is this: Rosalind is going to know who her father was, not a sanitized version, not a myth, not the ghost his mother would have built if she'd gotten what she wanted, the real one. The man who built garden beds on weekends and color-coded his folders and trusted the wrong person once and spent the next 18 months quietly trying to make it right. The one who put my name on everything because he believed, without drama or announcement, that we were partners. That is what I'm giving her, the true one. I'm still in the house. The tomatoes are going in again this spring. I keep thinking about that piece of paper my mother-in-law slid across my kitchen table. The list of debts, the way she folded her hands after, so calm, so certain I would crumble. She wasn't wrong that I was broken. I was. I was 14 weeks pregnant and my husband had been dead for 11 days and I genuinely could not remember whether I'd eaten that morning. She read that correctly. What she miscalculated was what a person does with their breaking point once they find the floor. I've thought about why things unfolded the way they did, why her plan didn't work, why I'm still in this house, why Rosalind is asleep down the hall right now in the room Owen and I painted together. And I think the honest answer is that the outcome had almost nothing to do with luck. It had to do with choices. Hers, mine, Owen's. Every single one of them added up to something. Owen made a choice to trust someone he shouldn't have, and then he made a second choice to carry the consequence alone because he was ashamed. That second choice cost us both something real. I understand it, I do, but I also know now that protecting someone by keeping them in the dark isn't the same as protecting them. True decency between two people requires honesty, even when honesty is humiliating. Owen knew how to love me. He hadn't yet learned that loving me also meant trusting me with the hard things. That's the part I grieve quietly, separately from everything else. My mother-in-law made a choice to treat grief as an opportunity. She saw a young woman alone and frightened, and she decided that was a door. I don't think she's a monster. I think she's someone who decided a long time ago that family loyalty meant loyalty to her own interests, and she never examined that assumption closely enough. The world cooperated with her long enough that she stopped expecting it not to. And then it didn't cooperate, and she had nothing to fall back on because she'd built her whole position on the belief that I wouldn't know my rights, wouldn't make the calls, wouldn't hold the line. I made a choice, too. I got off the floor. Not immediately. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this story where the woman stands up on day one and fights brilliantly and everything resolves in a clean arc. That wasn't me. I lay in bed for 2 weeks. I lit the fog, and then my colleague showed up with groceries and a handwritten list, and I chose to pick up the phone. That choice required something I hadn't known I had yet. It required me to think clearly when everything in me wanted to go quiet, to look at the documents, to ask the questions, to sit across from Ms. Beaumont and actually listen instead of nodding blankly. There's a kind of strength that isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like courage from the outside. It looks like paperwork and phone calls and showing up to appointments when you'd rather not exist that day. But it is strength. It is the most useful kind. Rosalind is going to know this story one day, not as a cautionary tale about bad people, but as something more specific. A story about what it looks like to keep your character intact when someone is betting everything on you losing it. To act with honesty even when the other side isn't. To think your way through something instead of reacting from fear. To stay standing, not because it's easy, but because the thing you're standing for, a child, a home, a life that was real and good and worth continuing, is worth every difficult phone call and every form filled out in a fog of grief. The tomatoes are going in again this spring. Rosalind will be old enough to hand me the seedlings. That feels right to me. That feels like something worth building toward.